I will take you with me. You might learn something.
About soccer?
Nah, mate. Not about soccer. And for fuck's sake, stop saying soccer!
There's another myth that after the match, they also defied the Germans by not showing the Hitler salute. But we see pictures.
Do.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
So here we have a popular sports hero, and they now made a patriot and a resistance fighter out of him. That was very convenient.
And we both have to admit, it's a powerful story.
Yes, and when I was a kid, I believed it.
Same here. Yeah. That's what I grew up with. Matthias Sindelar was and is the most famous Austrian footballer between World Wars I and II. He was known for his elegant style of play in a period when Austrian soccer was really admired as this innovative model. He defined Austria's national team, known as the Miracle Team back then, and also his club, Austria Vienna. The country Austria then joins Nazi Germany between 1938 and 1945, and when that country, my home country, arises as an independent nation again, Sindelar becomes more than a footballer. He becomes a myth. The myth of the elegant Austrian who defied the Nazis. And this version of Sindelar has reached a wide international audience, from Italian graphic novels to newspaper articles such as this one from the British The Guardian, which says that during a game between Austria and Germany right before Austria becomes part of Nazi Germany, Sindelar, quote, celebrated by dancing in front of a packed director's box full of high-ranking Nazis. And in the months that followed, Sindelar, who never made any secret of his social democratic leanings, repeatedly refused to replay for Germany. In August 1938, he brought a café from Leo Drill, a Jew forced to give it up under new legislation, but Sindelar paid a very fair 20,000 Deutsche Mark and was censored by the authorities for his reluctance to put up Nazi posters. That's the story from The Guardian. Until recently, no historian has attempted to probe these stories deeply. The story of the elegant footballer who defies the Nazis is just too endearing for anti-fascist football fans worldwide, and also for Austrians who wanted to see themselves as victims of the Nazis. So, as far as the international English-speaking discussion about Sindelar and Austrian soccer around the Nazi regime is concerned, this episode is kind of a first. Because David Forster, a historian from Vienna, is with me today. He has published only in German so far, but his research into Sindelar's life and death is a path-breaking counter-narrative to the story of Sindelar the Resistor and Austria the Victim. We will journey from 1903 to 1938. That's Sindelar's lifespan. But we'll ask many hard questions of today along the way as well. About truth, about the nature of history, about collective forgetfulness, and about our responsibility as fans of and as storytellers about the beautiful game today. And before we get there, as usual, please don't forget to leave a star rating in your podcast app if you haven't done so yet. It really helps. Tell a friend. That may help even more if you have people around you who are interested in this kind of different soccer coverage. And or leave me a voicemail through the link in the show notes. It's just 2 clicks for feedback, for topic suggestions, or just for greetings. And that always makes me very happy as well to hear from you. And now, journey with me to Vienna. Welcome, David. Thank you for your time. Always good to talk to fellow historians. You're sitting in Vienna, so the place where it all went down. But before we travel back to the early 20th century and meet Matthias Sindelar, meets the glory days of Austrian football, who are you? What's your journey into football history? What's your relation to the game? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, hello from Vienna. I'm a historian. I'm 51 years old. I came to love football when I was 6 years old and instantly became a follower of a Viennese club called Austria Vienna is actually the name of the club. And I became a fan of them because they were very, very good back in 1978, which appealed to me as a 6-year-old. I stayed with them through thick and thin. They are the most successful club in Austria's history, but they have been plagued by long phases of mismanagement and terrible defeats. So it's not easy to be a fan of this club.
But it's fair to say it is one of the two big Vienna clubs.
Right.
The other one being Repeat. You don't have to name them. I will. So those are the two big ones in Vienna, and we'll stumble over one or two more in the course of today as well, since especially the Austria plays a story in Matthias Sindelar's story too. Yeah.
That's right. And in my line of work as historian, I've been working freelance for a decade and taught at the University of Vienna. Then I have been an archivist for the Jewish community of Vienna for another 12 years. And in the past 2 years, I've been, as an historian, an authorized expert for the city of Vienna, and we're doing citizenships for the descendants of Nazi victims. And in all these projects and jobs, whether I worked on Jews in Vienna or deserters from the Wehrmacht, I always encountered footballers and football stories in the files. And this made me approach football history in a different way. And they kind of fell into my lap most of the time. Whatever I was working on, I stumbled across footballers and Nazis.
You may think it fell into your lap, but it's not an intuitive combination, football and Nazi history in Austria. In fact, for a long time, there was very, very little written, purposefully, very little written about it. And you were a big part of the Renaissance in the last 10, 15 years on that topic, especially with the big book you co-authored. Could you tell us a little bit about that book?
Yes, the book.
So it's Football Under the Swastika, Fußball unterm Hakenkreuz is the German title.
That's right. The book is kind of the culmination of a decade of research on the subject. And here we have all sorts of chapters on Austrian clubs, important games in the Nazi era, and generally trying to explain what the myths and legends did in post-war Austria. Because the legends that were created around the Nazi era were fundamental to building the Austrian identity after the Second World War.
Austria Vienna is one of the Austrian clubs that had Jews in very prominent positions, off the pitch in particular, before 1938, was then forcibly renamed. How happy are you with how your own club has handled a critical look at its past during the Nazi regime?
Not happy. It's one of the worst, actually, because they just focused on being the victim in these stories. And they are annoyed by people telling them about other aspects like perpetrators or profiteers, people who profiteered from the Nazi era. So I was called all kinds of names, and my own club basically said they don't want me there because of my research. It got a little better in the past few years because finally they conducted research on the Nazi period, but more or less by people whom they knew would not criticize the club. So again, it's kind of lukewarm, but it has been worse. On the contrary, the city rival Rapid, which you mentioned earlier, they were very clumsy in the beginning, and then they did the right thing and jumped right into the cold water and said, okay, we need a clean slate. We need to look at this. We need to look at this critically, show us the facts. And this is what happened in our research. So it was a different approach, a more honest one. It makes no sense to lay back and just focus on being the victim. But as a whole, Austria, the Republic of Austria, tried to do this after World War II. So in a way, and this was one of my initial thoughts when I started this research 20 years ago, was that you can explain the Republic of Austria, the country, by telling the story of one of its most successful, or the most successful football team, Austria.
I think you're arguing, let me know if I'm putting words in your mouth here, but you can also tell quite a bit about some of the lies that Austria likes to live by, some of the myths that Austria likes to live by looking into the biography of arguably one of its most famous footballers as well. We'll focus on him here in a little bit. Just briefly mention your co-author for Football under a Swastika, Fußball unterm Hakenkreuz, is a repeat fan, correct? So you split it up half.
That's right.
One has to have hard feelings.
Georg Spitaler, George, he is a vivid supporter of Rapid, and so we have the two most important Austrian clubs. Funnily enough, whenever we write about a subject, when we criticize Austria, the football club, everyone says, "Oh, they must be Rapid fans."
Right.
They can't. So, and we can always tell them, "Yeah, we're 1-1." So that's fun. Yeah.
Good. I also found an interview that Georg Spitaler gave to WBUR, public radio station here in the US, and we'll link that in the show notes as well. Interesting notes in there as well. Our story starts when, well, Austria is still Austria-Hungary. It's a big empire. It's a monarchy with Vienna as its not quite yet oversized capital city, but certainly a global metropolis in many ways. And in 1903, Matthias Sindelar is born, and he's not born in what is today Austria, right?
That's right, because today's Republic of Austria is actually a small country, while it was a vast empire back then at the start of the 20th century. And when Matthias Sindelar, one of Austria's most famous players, was born in 1903, it was in Bohemia, today the Czech Republic, in Kozlau, a town there. Yes, it's not today's Austria, but of course they were all Austrians back then under the rule of the Austrian emperor.
About 35 years later, Matthias Sindelar is found dead in his apartment. And until today, biographies of him, reports about him have headlines like "The Footballer Who Defied the Nazis." These Football Times, well-known online publication, ran an article that said Sindelar made no mystery of his dislike for the Nazi regime. Howler magazine, well-known here in the U.S., at least suggests that he may have been killed. Often an interview is cited from one of Sindelar's friends that he gave to the BBC for that. And The Guardian, British newspaper, tells us that Matthias Sindelar once celebrated a goal against Germany in front of the director's box, packed with high-ranking Nazis, dancing there and celebrating an act of defiance. Your first YouTube hit until today for an English-speaking Sindelar search is a video entitled "The Footballer Who Defied the Nazis" that has tens of thousands of clicks there. So we'll try to get from 1903 in what is now the Czech Republic to those kind of headlines, and then unravel the threads from there a little bit. First, we need to get to how Matthias Sindelar becomes a footballer, period. How does that happen? Does he move to Vienna to play football? Does his family move there? And when does his talent begin to be obvious to observers?
Yeah, well, they moved to Vienna, and he came from a very typical Bohemian or Czech family. They were workers. He was located in a district where many Czechs worked and lived, the Viennese Czechs.
Is this the 10th district of Vienna?
Yes, that's the 10th district of Vienna, where today the football club Austria is still residing, has the stadium there. And this is still the early days of Austrian football. But when Matthias Sindelar starts to emerge in the early 1920s, there is already a shift towards more professionalism and football that is well known in Europe. So Sindelar, when he starts to show up on the stage, the Austrian football is in a kind of transition to be more professional and to be known within Europe. And he first plays for a smaller club in Vienna called Hertha, but pretty soon he is discovered, although he's only part of a deal. His club, his later club, the club he played most of his active time for, Austria, they actually wanted to buy another player, and he was just part of the package. Also, he was very thin and frail, and he had a knee injury. So let's just say his prospects weren't looking too good at this point. Not that he's still, I mean, we are talking about him now decades later, and he's still known in the world of football. But his start was actually a bit shaky, maybe like his knee, but he was operated on, and he focused on technique instead of brute force, or he was not an athlete.
Yeah.
He was more the thin guy that could be blown away by a gush of wind. And Der Papierene, paper man, or man out of paper, was one of his nicknames. And that's because not only was he quite thin, it was also part of his technique. To avoid possible injuries, he had to dodge and duck on the field and dance through his opponents like a sheet of paper. So this is how his nickname came to be. But as soon as he joined Austria Vienna, the club, and was operated on his knee, he basically rose to stardom. First within his club, later on with Austria's national team.
When he joins Austria Vienna, what year is that?
1924. This is when professional football in Austria starts. For example, the football players get paid by their clubs, and this is a huge difference compared to other countries like Germany, who had amateur football for many years to come.
1924, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is no more. Austria is a small place all of a sudden. It's not an empire of worldwide relevance anymore. And it does something to the psyche of the nation for sure. And the political system is about to change as well. Can we say a little bit about the context of what kind of city is that Sindelar finds himself in, and where is the country headed at this time?
Yes, it's still one of the biggest cities in the world, but it's the former capital of an empire. And people are confused, depressed. The country suddenly in 1918 was reduced to today's borders. And it's actually a very small country in the heart of Europe. And political tensions between the left and the right were high. But already in the mid-20s, you have the left and the right, plus even the Nazis rising very early. In 1925, we have incidents of violence where hundreds of Nazis are attacking Jewish cafes, for instance.
Is there any inkling during this time? I mean, Sindelar becomes very well known. He becomes a national team player. He is an advertising testimonial as well. I mean, he's making money off that too once he becomes famous. Is there any inkling that we have that he was a politically thinking human being at that time as well?
I don't think he was actually politically affiliated with any party, but I think he was by instinct or subconsciously a very political person, because he could live with every regime that he lived under, and always whoever was in power or in charge, there's a picture of the guy in charge shaking hands with Sindelar. So I guess he successfully made a lot of political transitions. And he never fell because he was able, on the basis of his popularity, on the basis of his sportsmanship, to survive political system changes.
Up until his final years, what do we need to know about the successes of the footballer Matthias Sindelar in order to understand how big the guy is in the Austrian public at the time and for the European footballing world?
Well, he played for the first time for Austria's national team in 1926. And played for them till December 1937. And within that time period is one of Austria's most successful football eras, and one of the periods where every Austrian football fan gets warm feelings about. It's the era of the Wunder team. It's a miracle team. It's
very warm and fuzzy feelings, yes.
Yeah, warm and fuzzy feelings. Because while Austria was small and not playing a major role on the European political landscape anymore, they were certainly on Europe's football map. And between 1931 and 33, they beat almost every important opponent, and they played England, who were at the time undefeated on home ground, and were still 20 years later undefeated on their home ground, and they just lost by the Austrians lost by 1 goal, 4-3 for England, and this was seen as a victory of sorts in Austria. So Sindelar, he played a major role in that miracle team, and with his club, Austria, he won the Mitropa Cup. This was a tournament style that can be compared to today's Champions League. So it was basically the most important title a European football club could win at the time.
Europe-wide club competition, yeah.
Yes. He won this twice. So this is among the highlights. He played 43 times for Austria's national team and scored 27 goals. He was beloved by the public. As you said, he did advertisement. He starred in a movie, and this at a time when not even a handful of players were able to do that.
What kind of movie was that at the time?
Oh, it was I would say, romantic comedy with football elements.
All right. Oh, yeah, that fits.
It's like an Elvis movie, actually.
Okay.
Just based around Sindelar and other football players. It's called Roxy and the Miracle Team. Roxy und ihr Wunder Team.
So we're getting to the crucial years of 1937, 1938 here. Just a little bit of a timeline. For the years between 1933 and the annexation through Nazi Germany of Austria, Austria is ruled by its own proto-fascist regime that eliminates the ability of the parliament to work in a proper democratic republican way and develops its own authoritarianism in defiance both against Germany and against the socialist left in Austria itself. You said that football in Austria is professional already. Germany comes in and German football structures come in as well. How does that change the game at the time when that transition happens, to which the overwhelming majority of the Austrian people eventually says, yes, we want to join Germany?
Yes, the Anschluss or annexation of Austria in March 1938, this is a deep cut in Austria's football history. And it had a major impact. First of all, professionalism. Paid football players were not allowed anymore. So they were relegated back to amateur status. Because the Germans played amateur football, the Austrians had to go back there. So you have highly paid, for the time, football professionals who suddenly don't have a job. We should keep that in mind for later discussion. Also, all Jews were forced out of Austrian football. That's not only players, functionaries, it's referees, journalists, everyone who is in touch with football on a professional level. Plus, minorities like the Viennese Czech, they are controlled, as well as any leftist elements that even were still in place after 5 years of the homemade Austrian fascism that ruled for half a decade. So yes, it was a very sudden change on many levels. Some clubs were Aryanized as a whole or put under control. And this is what actually happened in the early days after the Anschluss to Sindelar's club, Austria.
Right. I was just going to ask. I mean, there's Jews on the board there. What happens to his own club? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they had to close down for a few days, and then they were put under Aryan control. The Jewish club president and many functionaries had to flee. Some of them were murdered later on in Europe, in the countries they fled to. For instance, the manager Robert Lang was killed in Yugoslavia when the Nazis invaded Yugoslavia. There were at the time no more Jewish players, but lots of people on the board. Yes, and they seized the home ground, they seized club valuables, and put the club under Aryan control. And they even renamed the club. It was not allowed to be called Austria for a while.
Of course, there is no Austria in a way. Yeah.
Exactly. The country is annihilated, so annexed and gone. So the name also had to be eradicated. I don't know if that's the proper word for it.
Eradicated, I think.
Eradicated, yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. So they renamed both the country and the club into Ostmark. But even the Nazis realized after a while that nobody knows this club anymore, and they don't get any invitations to important games anymore, and they're actually losing money on the new name. So Austria, the club, was allowed to get its name back.
Okay, so it's an early case of rebranding going wrong.
Yes, that's rebranding going terribly wrong. Yeah. But the new club officials made sure that they have powerful Nazis on the board to protect the club and ensure its survival in a way.
What happens to Sindelar? I mean, you mentioned professional soccer is on its way out. He doesn't get paid by Ostmark or Austria anymore. What does he do? What steps does he take? Does he have any plan B for what if my soccer career doesn't work out the way it should? What are his steps as he approaches 1938 and the annexation is coming?
Well, generally, the Nazis realized that you have to provide for the most famous football players. You can't have them being unemployed and on the street, and you can't have them not to play, because what the Nazis wanted was normality. They wanted a smooth transition. So they said, well, let's give the football players jobs, other jobs, not football, not paid football anymore, but let's give them shops and coffee houses or petrol stations, or maybe they could work for the city government of Vienna. So they provided. Matthias Sindelar, he was 35 years old at the time of the Anschluss, and it was the eve of his career anyway. He was injured in late 1937 when he played for the last time for the Austrian national team. And he knew that his glory days are over. His club is facing problems now under the new regime.
There won't be any national team anymore. There
won't be any national team, but there will be a world championship, France 1938, where Austria actually was qualified for to play in that tournament. So yes, he had to think what to do next. And his decision was to Aryanize a coffee house.
So this is fairly widespread at the time, particularly early on. The government directed loss of property and transfer from Jewish owners to new non-Jewish owners, right? How does Sindelar get caught up in this? Does he walk into this coffee house and say, hey, I'm a footballer, I'm not a Jew, and this should be mine now? How does the process of Aryanization work in this case?
Sindelar knew the coffee house he Aryanized because he was playing cards there and drinking coffee for quite a few years with other football players.
Right. And we should say coffee houses occupy a very central place in the social, cultural life of Vienna.
Yes, there have been hundreds of coffee houses in Vienna back at this time, and they were places where the poor and the rich, politicians, journalists, people from the economy, industrialists, women, people who are in arts, in sports, they all meet there, read the newspaper, drink coffee, gossip, chat, do business. So these were very important
smoke,
places.
right?
Oh yes, you could smoke in Viennese coffee houses till 10 years ago, I think.
Yes, Starbucks killed that vibe.
Yeah, probably. So Sindelar knew the coffee house that he was interested in. But to come back to your question, it was also possibly in March, April 1938 to just march into a coffee house with a Jewish owner, and just rob it. Basically, that was possible for a while. It's called wild Aryanizations. But the regime wanted to put a lid on this. They wanted the robbery to go controlled, and that the state, the Nazi state, can participate by getting all kinds of taxes and fees for disorganized robbery. So in the case of Café Annahof, which was owned by a Jew named Simon Drill. In the case of his coffee house, there had already been a hostile takeover. A so-called commissar got hold of the property, but he was only in charge until the Aryanization of the coffee house was done. And this is where Sindelar comes in. The Jewish owners were put under a lot of pressure to sell their property. But of course, it was not a fair sale by any means. The case of Mr. Drill, the man, the Nazi who put himself more or less in charge.
Well, it was the administrator of sorts.
Yeah. Yes, he was an administrator of sorts who filled his pockets while administrating the coffee house. He had the son of the owner and half of the guests transported to the concentration camp Dachau, which put the owner under a lot of pressure to get his son out. And the only possibility to do that was to say, yes, I will sell my coffee house. And after Mr. Drill did this, Sindelar stepped in, and all he needed to do was to announce, yes, and I will buy this coffee house. And there are no negotiations at all. It's more an administrative process where the value of the coffee house is estimated.
But does Sindelar pay a fair price?
No, he did not. It's obvious that he didn't even pay the estimations that the Nazi administration set.
Is it still around today? The coffee house? Is it still a coffee house?
Oh, it was till the 1970s, and then it was demolished.
Okay.
It was returned after the war to the heirs of Mr. Drill, who himself was murdered by the Nazis.
At this point, since we just talked about Mr. Drill and his family, Matthias Sindelar is not married, correct? He has a partner, but he doesn't have kids. Is that right?
Yes, he was single all of his life, and he lived with his mother all of his life. Even as one of the most famous football player in Europe, he had girlfriends, and he actually died in one of the in the flat of one of his girlfriends.
Yeah, we'll get there soon. There is, of course, the intent to make the annexation go as smooth as possible. Many Austrians don't need convincing. I think this is also one of the myths that Austrians like to tell themselves, that secretly many were grumbling. On the other hand, we have plenty of evidence of droves of people on the streets of Austrian towns welcoming the Nazis. And from top down, the idea is to create an orderly merger, an orderly return home of Austria from a Nazi perspective. And part of that is to have a friendly match between the two football teams of Germany and Austria. And so that's coming up. And it's still before the World Cup. When is that famous game scheduled? And then when does it happen?
Yeah, it happened in early April 1938, a week before the rigged vote. There was a popular vote both in Austria and Germany whether Austria should join Germany, which of course had already been done. And it was also rigged in that sense that it was more like an open election, not a secret vote, and that people were put under immense pressure to say yes. Around this popular vote about the annexation, there were lots of cultural events, lots of marches and speeches and sports events. And they also had to create a solution for their two national teams that they're now having, Austria and Germany. And they wanted to combine these two teams. So they said, let's make a real celebration of football in Vienna. We'll have, for the last time, the Austrian side playing the German team, and then we merge them. Because with the World Cup coming up, the coach, Reichstrainer Sepp Herberger, had the political instruction to build a new team using the formula 6+5. On a soccer team, there are 11 players, and they should be distributed between Austria and Germany as equally as possible. So it's either 6 Austrians, 5 German, or the other way around. That was the agenda. But before that, a few weeks before the World Cup, there was this game in the packed national stadium of Vienna.
What steps are being taken by the Nazis to make sure that this friendly game is as friendly as possible and is as helpful as possible for the transition that they have in mind there?
Oh, they had the Austrian players welcome the German players at the train station. All the newspapers focused on this being a friendly football fest. Also, the German coach was given instruction that his players shouldn't play too physical, because the Austrians don't like that. The Austrians were still playing their technical football. The Germans, on the other side, at this point were a pretty well-oiled machine, but they
more
played
physical too.
Yes, they played physical football, and the German coach was given. You can read that in the football archives, in Germany's football archives in Frankfurt. And the German coach was given the instruction, don't let them play too hard, because what we want is a friendly match. The Austrians, as seen in the documents, had no instructions, and they intended to play their football at their best.
Anything in the stadium in terms of speeches, flags that we know about from documents at the time that
yes,
were clearly political as well?
Yeah, lots of speeches, lots of flags, lots of Nazi flags, but also famous football players transporting the message, vote yes. So this was shown all the time, vote yes for the annexation. There had been during the World Cup 1934 and following, there had been tensions between Football Austria and Football Germany. And this was intended to smooth these frictions over and yes, create a happy spirit. There were thousands of German soldiers in the audience who were on leave for the day. It was a Saturday, and 10,000 of Viennese people who were already in a festive mood, because every day was filled with parades and marches, and everyone was telling them how happy Nazi Germany is that finally Austria is coming home to the Führer.
Austria is playing in red, white, and red, the Austrian national flag. There is the theory that Sindelar wanted that to happen, or that is kind of an act of resistance. Is that true?
Whether this was Sindelar's idea, we will never know. The fact is, the two teams had the same colors. Both played white shirts, black trousers, and it is obvious that they can't do that if they face each other. So one side had to play in different colors, and the Austrian team already had used the red and white dress at other occasions. For instance, the famous England game in 1932 we talked about earlier. So they just kind of got back to this look. In a way, Germany playing in white and black could also be interpreted as a symbol for them being on home ground. In a way, both played in their home shirts, could be said. But the reason for all of this is much more profane than later myth tried to explain. Because the simple fact is just they can't play both in the same white and black outfit.
How does the game end?
The Austrians won 2-0. Sindelar and his friend from Austrian Football Club Austria, Karl Schester, who also Aryanized a bakery, they scored for Austria. So I guess people were in a good mood that day. But it was also goodbye for Austrian's national football team till 1945. And it should be the last time the Austrian side won over the German side for 40 years, till 1978.
Yes, and that's the starting point for a whole different set of myths.
Oh, yes.
This is the famous game where you have some of the sources I mentioned at the beginning of our conversations, right? The video, there's the footballer who danced in front of the Nazis on the stands. What do we actually know from video material, from photographic evidence at the time about Sindelar's behavior during the game and about that of the Austrian team more broadly?
Yes. Well, I looked at a lot of pictures taken on that day, and I looked at all the evidence on film from that day. And what we cannot see is what is described in most of the books. There certainly is no dance by Matthias Sindelar in front of Nazi functionaries. It's more like he raises his arms and goes to the middle of the field to see the kickoff after a goal. A pretty normal process, all in all.
Where does the theory come from? So the story that he's kind of doing a provocative jig in front of Nazis. Do we know where that's originating? Because it's very popular. This is how I grew up, and this was always something to point to that, in truth, we didn't really want to be Nazis, and one of our most famous footballers proves it.
I think this myth started somewhere in the 1970s, the latest. I think there are more myths about this game than any other, starting with the red-white outfits, the dance after scoring the goal, also the rumor that there had been orders that the Austrians should not win or even should not score a goal. Of course, this makes the whole game in retrospective even more exciting. If you feel like the Austrian side is not only playing for the last time, but they're defying the Germans and they're acting against explicit orders. But
it would be a heroic story of sorts if true, but you're saying we have very little evidence for any of these assertions, right?
Yes. We have some evidence. We have good evidence that there have been no orders for the Austrians to lose, not win, or not score a goal. So that myth instantly crumbles. We don't have the full 90 minutes on videos because back then that wasn't done. But we can see scenes after the goal and after the match, because there is another myth that after the match they also defied the Germans by not showing the Hitler salute. But we see pictures.
Do.
Yes, they do. Yeah. So there is evidence enough that points us to the conclusion that these are myths.
Then the Anschluss, the annexation happens, and this is also featured in many Sindelar stories. He refuses to play for the German national team.
Yes.
Because he never made a secret, supposedly, of his social democratic leanings, for which we walk through that. He found a way to arrange himself with all kinds of government. And then the theory goes he refuses to play for the Nazis.
Yes. I don't think he ever had social democratic leanings or strong ones. He was raised in a workers' milieu, yes. So he might have been leftist initially. But he also arranged himself with the Austrian fascists from the Austrian right. And he arranged himself with the Nazis. He Aryanized the coffee house. He had other jobs offered by the Viennese Nazi government. He could have been the director of or the manager of the Viennese National Stadium. This was initially, this was just before he died. He was offered this job. So we don't know what would have happened. And he played a role in the new board of his club, where they had eliminated all Jews on the board. He participated in that together with real Nazis. So I would say he arranged himself with the new powers.
So what's the explanation then that he never plays for Germany?
Yes. When Herberger, the coach of the greater German football team, prepared for the World Cup, Austria had to tell the FIFA that they will not play the World Cup. So they forfeited their first game. And Herberger, he did several courses, it was called back then. It was basically a training camp where he looked at his player material. He now had much too many players to choose from. And he wasn't amused because he wanted the 11 players he had built up in the past few years. These were his 11 chosen players. And the Nazis wanted at least 5 Austrians in there. The public demanded this. It also made kind of sense because they were still world famous players. But Sindelar, with his age of 35, his injuries, he didn't want the competition for a place on this, for a slot on this new World Cup team. So he conversed with Coach Herberger. Herberger tried to convince him to join the team. Many of Sindelar's younger teammates did, but he declined to go on these courses. He didn't want to face the German who could play his position and then maybe be slower, maybe be less effective. Maybe the new coach just tells him, well, you're gone, you're old.
He might pick up an injury.
Or he might get injured.
Playing against German defenders all the time in these courses. Yeah.
He surely did not want to be humiliated by being in this competitive kind of transition, the merging of the two teams, with the coach being the German coach. The person who gets to decide is not the Austrian coach. The Austrian coach is relegated to the sidelines, and this makes no sense. Sindelar could lose everything, his health, his reputation. It would be the ultimate humiliation if he weren't on the roster for France 1938.
He is 35 years old when that process develops, the merging of the national teams. He will not see his 36th birthday. He will not see the World Cup that's coming up either. And he will not become the stadium manager because on January 23rd, 1939, he's found dead by one of his friends in a apartment. Was he murdered by the Nazis, David?
No, he probably not. No, he wasn't. He saw the World Cup, by the way, but not all the other developments.
Oh yes, of course. 30.
Yes.
Yeah.
When he died on January 23, 1939, almost instantly, rumors flared up that there has been a suicide or even a murder. So the basis for the legends and the myths surrounding his death, they start right away, almost at the hour of his death. The circumstances, the facts that we know is he was spending the night with his girlfriend. She was an elderly woman, one might say. who had a pretty rundown establishment. She had a flat in the first district, which is the city center of Vienna.
Mm-hmm.
And the couple was found the morning after, with Sindelar being dead, her dying without regaining consciousness. And initial newspaper reports focused on a bottle of liquor that had been found in the flat, and wild rumors spread that the two lovers committed double suicide, or that various parties might have killed Sindelar. For instance, his girlfriend was among the suspects.
Yes, that's reasonable. Mm-hmm.
Their contacts, Sindelar did a lot of gambling, card gambling, sport bets, etc.
In the coffee houses.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And in the dubious circles, his girlfriend might have been, it is said that she was moving through shady circles. So
okay, well, thank you for the illusions. Yeah, we can kind of
yeah.
Circles have been.
So we have these rumors, and then the police concludes no, the stove, the oven, this might have killed them, a leak in their carbon monoxide
poisoning, right?
Carbon monoxide.
What it is in English. Yeah.
Carbon monoxide poisoning, which was a very common cause of death at the time.
Right.
So,
I mean, a suicide would feed the narrative later, memorialized in a poem, which we'll get to, that the suggestion that he killed himself out of despair over what happened to his country and the Nazi takeover, and the oven is the way out that he saw from this situation. The rumor circulated early on that it was suicide. Any hunch did you have that we should pursue the theory?
Personally, I believe the accident theory. It was a common cause of accidents and deaths in Vienna at the time. The stoves leaking and people suffocating. This happened quite frequently at this time. So yes, I'm a firm believer of the accident explanation. The suicide conspiracy theory got a new drift in almost instantly in 1939, because Jewish authors who were fleeing from Nazis in Austria after the Anschluss and were in France, they were absolutely shocked when they heard the news that the beloved football player Matthias Sindelar had died. And I think what happened there is them writing all kinds of poems, as you mentioned, and newspaper articles on the death of this great football player. They didn't know he Aryanized a coffee house, and they kind of thought about their own misery, being forced out of their home country, now living abroad. And they could not see any other explanation than Sindelar, who cannot bear it anymore, who feels the oppression of Nazis trampling through Vienna. So it's basically the conclusion of the Jewish people in exile, the Viennese authors, who say, oh, he might have killed himself out of despair because of Nazi tyranny. And this feeds the whole legends for decades to come. With the murder explanation, after the war, we also have the the theory is that it was not crime related, or out of that it was not that it was not the girlfriend who killed him. But we have a new theory on this, and this is he was killed by the Gestapo or other Nazi authorities.
Right. The least amount of evidence for that.
Yes, there's no evidence for it, but it did not help that the police report about the accident got lost. So that of course, always feeds a myth. And with all famous people, being that Jim Morrison, Elvis Presley, or whoever, Michael Jackson, you always have wild theories flying. They're not dead, or they were killed, etc., etc.
The poem mentioned before is from Friedrich Thorberg. There is, to the best of my knowledge, no English translation of that poem. Maybe it's time to do one, but the verse that's relevant here is Thorberg saying that Sindelar had this instinctual ability to combine things and to see multiple things at the same time and make a decision on the field of play. And this ability allowed him to see that his chance for a way out was in the gas pipe. It lay in the exhaust of the apartment. And that is the suggestion here, that he committed suicide in that poem. All right.
Yes, it's a very moving, it's a very good poem.
Very good poem.
It's of course not based on facts. Thorberg, who had to flee, who was a vivid follower of Viennese football clubs. He was a real fan, and he felt the tragic loss, but he also felt the loss he had to endure himself, being forced out of Vienna. So he combined all this misery and feelings of loss into this great poem. It's a piece of art. It's very likely not based on facts, but it's art. It doesn't need to be based on facts.
Right. It is. I mean, there's that verse there. Above most of the poem is a portrait of Sindelar's style of play, and a vivid and at times very funny and light portrait with some double meanings about life in general as well. So it's a beautiful example of how football can speak through art to multiple dimensions as well. 1970s, you said, at latest, is when the myths start to contribute to Austria's effort in reconstructing its identity after the Nazis.
I meant a specific myth that you mentioned earlier when you asked me
the myths about the game.
Yes, that started in the 70s, but the myths about Sindelar's death, Sindelar's role in defying the Nazis, that's instantly there after the victim about Nazi Germany. That starts in 1945. 1946, we have the first Sindelar myths that get spun. But of course, in the following decades, the myths, they play a role of their own. And it's very important for Austria after the war to create a new working identity. Austria did not want to repeat mistakes made after World War I. So a new identity needed to be created. Austria needed heroes, and Austria needed to make a difference between Austria and Germany. While after World War I, most of the Austrians wanted to be part of Germany. This mistake needed to be avoided after World War II, of course. So here we have a popular sports hero, and they now made a patriot and a resistance fighter out of him. That was very convenient.
And we both have to admit, it's a powerful story.
Yes, and when I was a kid, I believed it.
Same here. Yeah. That's what I grew up with. Yeah.
It's in every book up until the end of the 80s. You don't have any other Schindler story than the myth. And all of it, fans, historians, journalists, they all retell this story, add new layers, for instance, for the murder theory, or for instance, new layers surrounding the match against Germany in 1938. But basically, the story starts immediately after his death and gets rehashed into this identity politics story in 1945-46.
It's not just Austria anymore either. I read some English-speaking examples early on of how the Schindler story is an internationally traveling story as well of anti-fascist resistance through football. Do you know of other examples internationally where Schindler is known, is written about, and among football fans is viewed as a resistant footballer?
Yes, it's a very powerful and popular myth. There are many Italian books, novels, history books.
There's graphic novels as well, right?
Graphic novels, children books, focusing on Schindler being in the resistance, or defying the Nazis, or being Jewish, or having a Jewish girlfriend and they were killed by the Nazis. So this is very popular in Italy. It's very popular in South America, Argentina, for instance. The English Wikipedia entry on Matthias Sindelar, every couple of months I used to check it, and they always changed it to Schindler being Jewish, which he was not. There's an American football history which had Schindler being blackmailed by a teammate because Schindler supposedly is Jewish, and then is the sentence in these books, and he gassed himself in his apartment, which kind of echoes Jews being murdered in gas chambers, I think. So it's a worldwide myth. I was at Twitter in my life only once. And what did I look up? Schindler. And all of the entries had Schindler the hero, Schindler the resistance fighter, Schindler being Jewish, or Schindler defying the Nazis. Hundreds of tweets.
It's very much the dominant narrative, yeah. And I mean, we hope that when this episode is out, we'll add a little line on Twitter search somewhere in there that maybe puts what you have researched out into the English speaking world as well. Why would we hope that? And that's a more basic, perhaps broad funneling out question, but why kill the myth? Why not let Austria rest happily in its assumption of its own victimhood? And why not let football have an anti-fascist hero as well? Why dig so deep?
Yeah, very good question, because the debate is now raging for 20 years. Been doing interviews for the past 20 years, and sometimes I get pretty tired. For instance, I was interviewed by a German history magazine. I talked to the journalist for a total of 4 hours. 2 times 2 hours. I explained what I found out. And then she wrote the Schindler, the resistance fighter article yet again. So I kind of felt like I wasted 4 good hours. So why is this important? I think in the mid to end 1980s, Austria for the first time took a look at itself in the mirror, surrounding President Waldheim, who was UN secretary. And there have been discussions about the role Austria and the Austrians played during the Nazi times. And I think these are very important discussions, because you cannot just put a lid or a carpet on all the ugly stories. You need to confront them as critically as possible, also as cool as possible. I think that even in the Sindelar debate, there had been too many emotions, and they instantly clouded the discussion. If on one extreme end of the debate, a colleague of mine kind of screamed, Sindelar was a Nazi. But this is not the point. He was no Nazi. He just profiteered by Aryanizing a coffee house and arranged himself with the Nazis. The more important point is what he did, what his moral choices were at the time. He could have said no to Aryanizing a coffee house. That would have been no problem at all. And he would have found another job. But it was the easy way for him to make money. So yes, I think whether it's art or football or any other field which exists in a society, we need to ask these questions. It's actually better for the political climate and kind of the collective psychology of the whole country, to look the truth in the eye and say, yes, that was that happened. And then you can still move on without forgetting it or downplaying it. But you need to clear these things up, and it makes no sense to kind of defend the myth. They're convenient, and they're certainly, most of the time, they're the better stories. They're just not true stories. And I wasn't interested in these fabrications anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I think at its best, and I, of course, asked the question before rhetorically, I'm a historian as well. And at its best, I think doing history has the capacity to lead us into a deeper and wider and more generous understanding of what it means to be human. And at its best, I think following football can do some of the same things. And that deeper and wider understanding of what it might mean to be human then eventually ends up diffusing some of the black versus white categories we have and according to which we judge or prejudge people. And that's where the virtue of complicating stories about the past lies, and the virtue of what you have done lies, I think. So on the surface of things, it might be the more boring story, yes, but it's also the deeper one, and it's the one that tells us most about the nuances and the weirdness of being a human being in difficult times.
I agree, and I think, yes, the gray zones, moral ambiguity, choices, these are actually interesting questions. The black and white stories, they might appeal easily or at first. Sometimes there are the better stories or the stories we would love to be true. But even in the gray zone stories, there's a lot of food for thought and a deeper understanding. And I think by explaining how the Nazi system worked, what choices there were or were not, and by explaining this around football stories, I think we can also reach a wider public. We can reach football fans and casual fans even, to think about the Nazi times.
The black and white stories are kind of the cotton candy of history, Zuckerwatte in German. It tastes good at first, but it also dissipates very quickly, and you're left wondering, what do I do now? You have served us more of a good meaty Austrian goulash.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
What are Your next projects, what are you up to next?
Well, actually, might sound funny, but being a father of two, I kind of put football history more or less on the sideline for a while. I'm always keeping an eye open for interesting stories. That's right. But there is no current project I'm working on. And I also feel that with the book, we did a grand sweep of Austria's football history, retelling the major legends. And actually, although the book is now, it was written 10 years ago, came out in 2014, and it still stands. What's in there still holds. Yes, but as I mentioned earlier, not only am I now a father of two, it's also pretty tiring to be the guy who tells the complicated story, to be the guy who deconstructs a myth. And I kind of feel that after this year, it's exactly 20 years of this historic debate on Sindelar. And while I'm always excited, as I think you can hear, to talk about him and to discuss this, I also feel pretty tired sometimes when I read new articles or even Wikipedia. Today I looked at the German German-speaking Wikipedia again, and it has all the half-truths and lies about Matthias Sindelar still in it. Yes. So that makes it pretty hard sometimes.
Well, much courage and strength to you. And
thank you.
And there's also always a real world outside of Wikipedia, and there's our children, and there's our friends, and there's our soccer clubs, and certainly things did change too over the last 20 years.
And there are definitely stories to be told with many football players in the Wehrmacht. With Sindelar probably has Aryanized a flat as well where he lived. So there's loose ends to look at. No, this can of course go on for many more years.
Well, somebody who's younger can pick that up too. Okay.
Yes.
Good. Well, here's an invitation. And if that younger person writes something in English, that would be particularly good, because your excellent book is still not translated into English. I don't know if that's in the works, but that would be great. Probably.
I have heard of no plans by the publishers to get it translated. No.
Okay. And the future of the Austria is on slightly shaky ground as well. I do wish you the best for your club as well.
They had a pretty bad start, and they're on a shaky financial fundament. So no, it's not the best situations, but Austria, the club, has endured, and it will. There's only two clubs in Austria's football history who have always played in the first major league, and this is Rapid in Austria, and I hope it stays that way.
Very good. Well,
thanks for the very interesting interview.
Thank you for the time, and thanks for unrolling the scroll again with us, and especially for doing it in English and putting the word out there in English as well.
Well, thank you
very much, David.
Thank you.
Greetings to Vienna, and be well.
You too.
It was a little longer, and I trust you agree it was worth it. And this wasn't planned because we will stay in Austria for the next episode as well. Austria's second largest city, Graz, has a derby again. The National Cup tournament was drawn and it pits Sturm Graz, currently in the first Austrian League and the Europa League, and also my club, against Grazer AK or GAK, currently in the second league. The game is in the first week of November, so we have to do an episode on it. Both clubs have a storied past with championships and with bankruptcies, and I can't wait to spend an hour of fun back and forth with an expert from each club. It will be the most spontaneous episode I've ever done, but trust me, it will be worth it as well. Until then,